program is the Active Center. It's created by David Sappe.
Pronounced Seppi.
Pronounced Seppi.
All right, let's jump right in. For more than 60 years, the Cuban Revolution has stood as this powerful symbol of defiance, promise, and, a whole lot of controversy. Today, we're going to unpack its incredibly complex story, from the guerrilla fighters in the mountains all the way to the deep crisis the island is facing right this minute.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. How on earth did a movement that promised a paradise, a utopia for everyone, end up creating a nation that is, by almost any measure, on the absolute brink of collapse? You know, to really get the revolution, you have to rewind and look at what Cuba was like before. In the 1950s, Havana was sold to the world as this glamorous, sun-drenched playground, right? Full of flashy casinos and wild nightlife. But that glittering surface hid a much, much darker reality for the vast majority of Cubans. Yeah, that whole glamorous image, it was really built on a foundation of some very deep, very serious problems. So let's dig into the seeds of discontent that made a violent revolution feel not just possible, but for many, totally inevitable. The issues here were layered, and they ran deep. First, politically, you had a deeply corrupt dictatorship run by a guy named Fulgencio Batista, who'd taken power in a military coup. Then economically, the inequality was just staggering. You had a tiny, tiny elite living in absolute luxury, while huge numbers of people out in the countryside were facing literal starvation. And on top of all that, you had these deep social and racial divides, plus this really strong feeling that Cuba wasn't its own country, that it was basically a playground for the United States, which controlled huge chunks of the land and the economy. This was the perfect storm, the perfect breeding ground for a revolution. So into this powder keg steps this small, determined group of revolutionaries. And somehow, they manage to light the fuse and kick off a full-blown guerrilla war, and actually win.
Okay, so there are 4 people you really need to know to understand this story. On one side, you've got the dictator, Fulgencio Batista. And leading the fight against him are 3 iconic figures. Fidel Castro, the super charismatic lawyer who became the face of the movement. Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who turned out to be a brilliant military mind. And of course, Fidel's brother, Raul Castro, who was a top commander himself.
Now, their road to victory was not easy. I mean, not at all. It actually started with a huge failure, a botched attack in 1953 that ended up giving their movement its name, the 26th of July movement. After getting exiled, Castro comes back in 1956 with just 81 guys. They get ambushed almost the second they land, and only a handful manage to escape into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. But from that tiny group, they wage this brutal 2-year guerrilla war that just wears down Batista's army until, on New Year's Day 1959, he gets on a plane and flees. A week later, Castro rolls into Havana.
So you might be asking, how did this tiny band of rebels manage to beat a professional army? Well, they had a classic 3-part guerrilla strategy. First, they used the geography. Those dense, rugged mountains became their fortress. Second, they didn't fight big, direct battles. It was a war of attrition, all hit-and-run attacks, ambushing supply lines, anything to bleed the army dry. And third, and this might be the most crucial part, they won the hearts and minds of the poor farmers, who gave them food, information, and a constant supply of new fighters. The victory was a massive celebration for millions. But what came next was a swift and often very brutal consolidation of power that would go on to define Cuba for generations. Let's look at the promise versus the reality of this new Cuba. Okay, so this is absolutely key. Almost immediately after they won, the promises of democracy were just gone. All other political parties, banned. Elections, suspended indefinitely. And then they set up these revolutionary tribunals, which led to thousands of political opponents being executed or thrown in prison. One by one, fundamental freedoms were just dismantled. Freedom of the press vanished. All independent newspapers, radio stations, all seized by the state. Private property rights eliminated. Businesses, farms, homes were just confiscated with no payment. And the right to simply disagree with the government was totally erased. Dissent meant you were facing a prison cell, or worse, a firing squad. And this gets to the absolute core contradiction of the whole regime. The official message, the big promise, was all about creating a society of equals, eliminating personal wealth for the good of everyone. But in reality, that same system created total control, which concentrated unbelievable power and wealth
into the hands of one man. $900 million. That was the estimated personal net worth of a leader ruling a country where the average person made just a handful of dollars every month. Just let that number sink in for a second. So what happens when you combine that kind of repression with that kind of poverty? You get a mass exodus. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled the island any way they could, a lot of them on these flimsy homemade rafts. They became known as the balseros, the rafters. It was this unbelievably desperate gamble for freedom that, for thousands of them, ended tragically, right there in the ocean. And that brings us to the Cuba of today. What is daily life actually like for the average Cuban, who's living in an economy that seems to be stuck in a permanent state of crisis? This chart, wow, it really tells you everything you need to know. The average monthly salary in Cuba is around $40. 40. When you put that next to a neighboring country, the difference is just shocking. It's why most families have to rely on government food rations and money sent from relatives overseas just to get by. And that tiny salary is just one piece of the puzzle. The day-to-day reality for Cubans means constant, chronic shortages of everything: food, medicine, even electricity. The infrastructure, the roads, the buildings, they're all crumbling. And the island is still largely cut off from the rest of the world, stuck between that long-standing U.S. embargo and its own government's rigid economic controls that have just choked off any real growth for decades. So you have this combination of decay from the inside and intense pressure from the outside, and it's brought Cuba to a truly historic crossroads. The question for everyone is, what does the path forward even look like? Now, according to our source material, recent U.S. administrations have put in place what they call a maximum pressure campaign. This strategy includes things like trying to block critical oil supplies, diplomatically isolating the regime, and, especially after political changes in allied countries like Venezuela, making Havana a primary focus of U.S. policy in the region. And the vision being pushed by anti-communist groups and the Cuban community abroad is a total 180 from the current system. They're advocating for a transition to a constitutional republic, basically a system with a democratically elected government and legal protections for private property, all powered by a free market economy. And look, the pressure for change isn't just external. The system itself is cracking from the inside. We are talking about record-shattering inflation, daily blackouts that can last up to 15 hours, and a massive brain drain. More than 10% of the entire population has fled the country in just the last few years. Which leaves us with this final, really powerful thought. For so many people watching Cuba right now, the question isn't if this system, after more than 6 decades, is finally going to change. The much more urgent and, frankly, much more difficult question is, how is that transition going to be managed? How can you build a new future without the whole island collapsing into chaos?